I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Boonwurrung people of the Southeast Asian Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to thank you all for coming and supporting the ABC Friends, and thank the IVA and the Southern Bayside group for the work they've put into today. And in advance, so that we can not have official thank yous other than Gail at the end, I'll say thank you to the speakers now so that we've got more time for the panel discussions and questions. Our MC this afternoon probably needs no introduction to anyone in the room, but she has a very impressive CV, so I'll just give you a little bio. Gail Jennings is a former ABC broadcaster with 30 plus years of journalism, TV and radio presenter, and content developer. She holds a PhD in medical research and has been director of over a dozen national boards in the arts, sciences and medicine. Currently, she's an honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne Centre for Advancing Journalism and on the board of the ABC Alumni, whose banner is broken. Tragic. She's the author of 2 books, and in 2020 was awarded an Order of Australia, an AM, for significant service to science and to the broadcast media. I should have introduced myself as well. I'm Pam Creed, the current president. Forgot that bit. But welcome, Gail, and we're in very safe hands, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Pam, who's got out of her deathbed to be here today. Yesterday she couldn't talk, so very impressive. Thank you. And congratulations to ABC Friends for the 50th anniversary of being friends. I mean, what would the ABC do without you? You're just amazing. You're an absolute stalwart, particularly in these very difficult times. I'd also like to briefly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we're meeting, the Boonwurrung people from the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and note that the land has never been ceded. Now, as you know, the title of today's discussion is the ABC, its importance and its enemies. And I guess there's never been a better time to have this conversation than right now, because I think it would be fair to say that the ABC is its most vulnerable ever. Just tiny little dot points, which obviously our expert panel will discuss at length over the next hour before we go to your questions. As you know, the funding has been terrible from 2013. Over the next 8 years, successive coalition governments smashed $526 million from the budget, with about 640 journalists having to leave, and that means that at the moment, even though Albanese's put in a little bit of money, the ABC has lost about a third of its budget compared with the 1980s, the Hawke-Keating years, which is a massive cut. And at the same time, of course, we've moved to 24-hour news cycle and digital broadcasting, digital everything. So the ABC's had to not only keep free to air TV and radio, but it had to go into digital broadcasting, ABC Listen, ABC News Service, the most trusted in Australia, and the more people go to that than any other digital news service, because everyone else steals our news, including Claude. And so we've had to make hundreds and hundreds of podcasts and so on, social media as well. And this has caused waves of restructuring and further redundancies. Also, historically, there, of course, has been political interference in the governance of the ABC on the board, with disasters like Jonathan Shire, how could I pause? Jonathan Shire, Michelle Guthrie, chairs Justin Milne, and Ida Buttrose, all of whom have been chosen by coalition governments. I'm not being political here, these are just facts. And of course, that last disaster ended with the ABC going for some period without an MD or a chair. And it was incredibly demoralising and incredibly bad for its audiences. The impact of social media and the rise of the tech brothers and the bros and their platforms, including AI, have introduced a raft of challenges about truth and conversation and civility, which we'll talk about today. Fake news, right-wing entertainment-driven content, they're all great challenges to the ABC, or we should say the other way around, the ABC is a challenge to them, hence it's attacked and targeted, and which is something that one of the many things that Matthew Ricketson will be talking about today with his new book called Getting Murdocked, which is all about decades of intense bullying and misinformation by the Murdoch press. But the last two things I'll say is, of course, right at the moment in the last month we've had two new challenges. One has been to our editorial independence through the Royal Commission into anti-Semitism and social cohesion, which is great, but the Special Envoy for Anti-Semitism, who's got a role as advisor on the board, on that commission, Gillian Siegel, has proposed, both in her report last year and at the Royal Commission, and not yet been challenged, that there be a standing committee to oversee the editorial processes of the ABC, which means that you'd have, it doesn't matter what your views are about any of what's happening in Gaza or anything that's happening in Israel, or however you frame it, the fact is that would be a lobby group, an extreme lobby group, trying to have oversight on the decisions that the independent broadcaster would have to make, and we'll talk about that too. And the other thing, of course, is One Nation, which has sort of surged up in the polls, is being taken seriously. A week or so ago was seen as in the polls as maybe even be able to get government. And Pauline Hanson announced at the National Press Club that if they gain power, they're going to axe SBS and defund the ABC to make it a subscriber model and just keep little pockets in the regions. So these are real problems. I'm sorry to go on so much. I'm just setting a little bit of context. So we're very, very lucky to have people here today who know all about this, who are absolute experts and can discuss it at length and then take your questions. Let me introduce you to the experts. So Denis there on the far... I shouldn't say the far right. I won't say that. Denis there on my left. Thank you. Well done. He's a leading expert on media ethics, a political scientist and a former journalist. His 27 years of journalism took him through assistant editor of the Sydney Morning Herald and the associate editor of The Age. He holds a master's in public policy and a PhD in media ethics and accountability at the University of Melbourne, and he's conducted a wealth of independent social and policy research across education, health, environment and media fields. He's been a senior research fellow at the Centre for Public Policy, and more recently for the last, 10 years, you were at the Centre. He was excuse my voice, I'm having trouble with a cold. he was project coordinator in journalism, law and ethics at the Centre for Advancing Journalism, which is where we shared a room very amicably for quite some time, and he is now a senior research fellow there, honorary senior research fellow there. He's also the author of a number of books. He's perhaps the most prolific and admired contributor to The Conversation, and nowadays he's also co-chair of a wildly popular podcast called Truth, Lies and Media, which he does with former ABC presenter Nicole Chavesnik. Please welcome Denis. I'll jump to Zoe Daniel, the formidable and wonderful Zoe Daniel, the only independent and the first woman elected as a federal member for Goldstein in May 2022, and she only lost by a whisker in 25. Zoe was a TV and radio journalist with the ABC for 17 years, and she had 3 terms as a foreign correspondent, and they were scary: Southeast Asia, Africa and the United States. In those roles she covered the regime of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, the Sierra Leone Civil War, the Darfur Genocide and South Sudan. And in the US, as bureau chief in Washington, she reported on major global conflicts and disasters, including the disaster that was the 2016 US presidential election, which spawned one of her 3 books, Greetings from Trumpland. Zoe is now a very active freelance journalist. You will have read her fabulous article in The Guardian this morning. She's a mentor and an advocate for community voices. She's a change catalyst and hopefully a parliamentarian again soon. Welcome, Zoe. Matthew Ricketson is a nationally recognised and award-winning journalist and academic, and he holds a PhD in journalism from Monash University. He was a cadet at the age, and he did in fact work at the Australian and at the Sunday Herald before briskly moving on to the Australian office of Time magazine. He's been Professor of Communication at Deakin University for the last 9 years. Matthew's an expert in freedom of information and media regulation. He was selected by the federal government to assist former Judge Ray Finkelstein in the 2011 inquiry into independent media and the regulation. Sorry, not independent media and media regulation. He was 7 years as the chair of the Dart Centre in Asia Pacific, a union rep at the Australian Press Council on the board of the Copyright Agency. He's won many journalism awards. He's written 5 books, 2 of which have special relevance today. 2022, Who Needs the ABC, with Patrick Mullins. And just this month, Getting Murdocked, how Murdoch's media wields power and punishment, which was written with Professor Andrew Dodd of Melbourne Uni. It's published by Hardy Grant, and I think there's going to be some QR code where you can order that book should you want to at the end of the session. So I'm going to facilitate the discussion with our 3 wonderful guests for the next hour or so, and then we'll open it up to your questions. And we'll probably finish about 1:45, maybe closer to 2 o'clock when Zoe has to leave, depending on how we go. Okay, so after that long and lengthy... I'll let you all talk now. Okay, so Matthew, you've written about the ABC twice, in 2022 and this last book. So who does need the ABC?
We all do. We all do. That's the conclusion at the end of the book. The subtitle is... Sorry, am I too loud? Tell me if I'm too loud. Okay, the subtitle is Who Needs the ABC? Why Taking It for Granted is No Longer an Option. Right, you get the point now. I mean, Patrick Mullins and I wrote that book in the kind of last years of the coalition government led by Scott Morrison. And at that stage, I mean, it's several years ago now, but it's no exaggeration to say that the ABC was under existential threat. The coalition government had been trying to both, reduce its funding dramatically, interfere with its governance, endlessly debate and argue and personally hostilely attack the ABC for a range of things which we wrote about in the book. And, the fact that Anthony Albanese and Labor were elected in 2022 has taken the boot off the throat, so to speak. But as you mentioned, Gail, there are, as there basically has been throughout the ABC's history, there are serious issues that it still faces. But at least that particular existential threat has passed.
Denis, can I ask you, why does it matter? Why is the ABC important?
Just look across the Pacific. And then what you see there is the public sector broadcasting basically emasculated by Trump. The ABC is one of the key differences between our democracy and theirs. And as Matthew was just saying, we take it for granted at our peril.
Thank you. And Zoe?
I think the ABC is becoming more important every day because of the global environment that we're in. My observations from living and working overseas is that it's rare. It's a very rare public media model, certainly compared to the US, to have independent, publicly funded media organisations like the ABC and SBS is a rare diamond and something to protect. And I think that increasingly as the Australian commercial media market drifts towards a more US-style approach where people listen to, watch and read what they already believe, it's ever more important to have an independent, objective voice, ideally more than one, actually, in our thinning media market. But protecting the ABC, I think, is crucial, and they need to protect themselves too in the way that they adapt to the world and try to appeal to younger audiences, because I think one of the issues, obviously, that they face is fighting for an audience in a really evolving information landscape. And if people like you aren't there to fight for them, who will? And then they'll be at increasing political risk over time.
Thank you. Setting the stage well. So what are the greatest risks? I might ask each of you to say what you think the biggest enemies are so that we can start the discussion from there. Zoe?
Oh, look, I think there's sort of a range of enemies or risk factors, and there's the obvious sort of political dynamic, so around a threat from One Nation to defund the organisation, the antipathy of coalition governments over time towards the ABC, but I think actually we are at a death by a thousand cuts point. Certainly, I started working for the ABC in 1993, and I was doing radio only as journalist at that time. By the time I finished working for the ABC in 2020, I was doing everything from 30-second radio news stories to 45-minute documentaries, 24-hour television news, and writing for the website. So the demands on the journalists have increased, the number of journalists doing the work has decreased, and the way that they're valued in terms of what they're paid has also become really compressed. So the career paths through the organisation aren't there either, and it's sort of disincentivising young journalists from staying in the ABC. So it's sort of potentially an intended consequence, or a consequence that you might not predict from the kind of cuts that we've seen to the ABC over time, where actually people just don't want to work there because there's actually no way to build a career through the organisation. And then obviously the technological threats around everyone getting their news from social media, AI, and everything that's coming down the pipeline there. So there's enemies, but there's also threats and risks.
Denis, what would you say the greatest enemy is?
Well, I'm not going to steal Matthew's thunder and say Murdoch. He can say that for himself. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Gina Rinehart is playing herself into the media political landscape in a very big way. Rinehart is obviously a backer of One Nation. She's given Pauline a $1 million aeroplane, but in a sense, more importantly, she is financing a $26.5 million stake in Southern Cross Media, which is now the second largest commercial media organisation in the country. It owns the Seven West, the Seven television network, a range of radio stations. It's a very big organisation. And she's doing this by proxy. She is funding a guy called Bruce McWilliam to buy roughly a quarter of the shares in Seven West. So we should not just, when we look at other media threats to the ABC, we should not just stop at News Corporation, because if Rinehart gets her way and gets her 25% or 26% share of Southern Cross Media, then you can bet your life that will become a source of antagonism towards the ABC as well. And so when you add that to the technological threats that Zoe was just talking about, and you add the Murdoch threat that I'm sure Matthew will soon talk about, then you can see there is a wide spectrum of threats.
Well, I guess we're feeling really cheery, but let's go on to the fabulous book you just written, Getting Murdocked, because this is what I guess your fear would be partly Murdoch. I won't tell you what you're going to say.
I feel like I've been told twice now. That said, I will, before I get to that guy, Rupert Murdoch, I will add that to what Denis has said, that Gina Rinehart has been circling the Australian media like a shark for several decades now. I mean, she wanted to get onto the board of the Fairfax media organisation, now known as the Nine, or now subsumed into the Nine Entertainment Company, but she wanted a number of seats on the board, clearly with the intention of kind of influencing policy in Fairfax media, you know, publishers of The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian Financial Review, and so on. And I also remember that she was very keen for Andrew Bolt to get involved in television, which he subsequently did, but she wanted to back him in that because she saw him as a prominent and forceful advocate on television, which indeed he is. We can talk about the effect of that advocacy as well, but so she has been involved, and she continues to be involved, and she's ramping up that level of involvement. So that said, the Murdochs have a very even longer history in terms of their involvement with the ABC and their kind of relationship with the ABC, and it goes back to Rupert's father, Sir Keith Murdoch, back in the early 1930s when the ABC began, and the ABC and the commercial media newspapers were trying to work out arrangements for the news environment, and Keith Murdoch was an early opponent of the ABC and imposed restrictions on its the amount of broadcasting of news it could do and the source from which it was getting its news. So that goes way back then. It's also entirely fair to say that since Rupert Murdoch has been involved in the media, and that also goes back a very long way to the early 1950s, he's been a vehement opponent of public broadcasting, at least partly on ideological grounds. He's a strong advocate of free market capitalism, and so doesn't believe that the taxpayers' dollars should go towards funding public broadcasters. And also, commercially, it to any extent that ABC gets in his way commercially, he's opposed to it. He's an equal opportunity opponent in that sense, that anyone who gets in his way commercially becomes a target. But the kind of key difference, which I think has happened since the rise of the internet, is that the ABC has become a much more significant significant force in the Australian media scene. When I started in journalism, which is longer ago than Zoe and not quite as long ago as Denis, the ABC was trusted, reliable. It was radio and television. It was, it had the nickname Auntie, which suggested something comfortable and unthreatening, and most of the rest of the media, to the extent to which they paid attention to the ABC, was to kind of pat it fondly on the head or regard it with sort of bemusement or whatever, mild digs and so on. That is not the case anymore, and I think a lot of that, and Patrick and I wrote this in the book, think a lot of that has to do with the internet opened the door for the ABC, as Zoe has talked about from the practitioner's point of view, to be everywhere, online, social media, etc., for free. That's the key distinction. You still have to pay for your newspaper or your magazine or whatever. You don't have to pay to get news free online. And that represents a much more significant commercial threat to News Corporation. And so when you look at, they've ramped up that opposition and hostility. The other element that plays into that is the social media environment and what it has created in the last decade to 15 years, which Catherine Murphy's term for this is that the whole media environment's got a lot more shouty. Okay, nobody expresses an opinion, quietly and in a measured way. You express it, you yell it, and you yell about anyone who has a different point of view, and you generally yell about them in personal terms. If you see some resonance with Donald Trump, this is the kind of media environment we're in now, where if any of you have ever written something and posted online and been abused on all sorts of grounds, your appearance, your gender, your sexuality, your race, etc., that's what that kind of social media environment has bred. So News Corporation, along with that, has itself become much more shouty. I mean, there is Andrew Dodd and I in our book write that there was a moment where News Corporation could have been a leader, could have, with its weight around the world, in the United States and the United Kingdom and here, and an established news organisation, they could have led a more considered and an environment where you believed, not believe, but they said this is the kind of journalism we should be doing. News, opinion, robust, yes, but not necessarily personal and vitriolic. Would that have made a difference? Who knows? But they didn't choose to go down that route. They chose to go down the shoutier, louder, personal abuse route. And so they're part of that media ecosystem now, and it's all swirling around us, which is, if you have a dull ache in the back of your head, I suggest that's one of the reasons you've got it at the moment.
Well, of course, it's a huge it's a huge delight because you did the studies in the US, UK, and Australia, and you've talked about Trumpland. I mean, as we're going down that path where we are adopting that shouty, horrible stuff. So how do you three feel that Murdoch has specifically impacted on the ABC? I know they've been intimidated and harassed, but in what way is that translated into, I don't know, performance or people's viewers or...?
Take the Antoinette Lattouf case just as an example. It sums it all up. The Australian took against Antoinette Lattouf when she was hired for a 5-day radio stint on local radio in Sydney. That was part of their pro-Israel stance in relation to the Gaza matter, and they took against her on that ground, that she was basically a person of Muslim background. What did the ABC...
That's a controversial statement.
Well,
to be fair,
yeah. Well, she's a person.
It was on her private social media. Yeah.
Now, what did the ABC do? And this, I think, captures something important about all of this. The ABC listened to the Australian. When they terminated her, the Australian had a story about her termination before she got home. That tells me a few things. They listened, they felt pressured by the Australian, by News Corporation, and they acted to the detriment, and it turned out they acted unlawfully to the detriment of one of their staff. And I think the Antoinette Lattouf case exemplifies one of the fundamental problems that I see, not just in the ABC, but in the Australian media generally, that is lack of leadership. Take another specific example. ABC reporters have twice now, if not more, been ejected from One Nation events. Once on the eve of the Farah by-election on May the 9th, and again a couple of weeks ago at, of all places, a meeting of the Swan Chamber of Commerce in Perth. We have not heard a peep out of Hugh Marks or Kim Williams or the editor of The Age or the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald or the Financial Review or any of the commercial television from him. I don't expect very much anyway, but at least I would expect some leadership. And I think that's a fundamental weakness in the current media scene in Australia.
Zoe?
Yeah, so personally, I think that other media organisations should boycott One Nation's press conferences if they're going to exclude the ABC or anyone else. I think that is a solidarity moment where if we believe as a nation in a free press, in a democracy, other organisations should be saying, well, if they're being chucked out, we're not here either. And then One Nation loses their oxygen. And my observation from covering Trump in the States was that when he started doing that kind of thing back in 2016, and that was sort of the genesis of the enemy of the people and the fake news era, it took a little while, but eventually the media did sort of form a level of coalition against it and started pushing back much harder. So, you know, I agree with you. And I find it quite pathetic that it hasn't been elevated more. The incident in Farah when the regional journalists were chucked out of the room, I was surprised looking at the video that all of the other crews just didn't walk out with them. If I had been there, I can't see how ethically you'd go in to cover the press conference knowing that they were delivering that kind of intimidation.
Is it a reflection of the fact that even all the other media outlets have turned into the ravaging dogs?
Well, I think, you know, what we're talking about here is sort of fear. The ABC's fear of what would happen if it doesn't react to, you know, being on the front page of the Murdoch press. And it extends way beyond the ABC. It's all in our politics. I mean, you know, why do you think the government reacts as soon as something's in the Australian, even though the number of people reading the Australian is like this, and most of them are MPs sitting at their desk in Parliament and they're staffers? But there's sort of a historical fear of the power of the Murdoch press, which has turned elections in this country, we know that, has in the US elevated Trump to the extent that, you know, it's chicken and egg, but he got elected in 2016. And I think that, you know, there comes a point where the ABC needs to sort of dig in and say, well, this is who we are. We're going to stand on our principles, and we're going to stop sort of pandering to those kinds of attacks, because every time you pander to it, it just weakens your position further, and then here we are.
I think it's an interesting point you also made, Matthew, from your point, Zoe, when you were talking about the book with Andrew Dodd, Geelong ABC Friends, which is all the people that you profiled in those three countries or those three continents. Couldn't find a way. How do you deal with a bully? What was the answer in the end? It wasn't really anything, was it? Well, it was because there were lots of good stories. I'm sorry.
There was a chapter.
We'll just go and jump off the cliff over there.
That's right. Yes. Before you do jump off a cliff, there is a chapter at the end of the book called "Fighting Back," and various people have fought back. One local. We've called him a uniquely Australian irritant to News Corp, and that's Stephen Mayne, who's, a founder of Crikey and so on, and he has fought back. He's done kind of something that many journalists haven't done, which is that he's gone to News Corporation annual general meetings and asked Rupert Murdoch hard questions that Rupert Murdoch has had difficulty answering, and they've, as Stephen, told us, and we kind of charted in the book. News Corporation over the years has made it increasingly difficult for him to ask a question. They initially any shareholder could ask a question. So Stephen Mayne, his kind of gambit is to buy a small number of shares in a whole lot of different corporations. So he's able, as a shareholder, to ask questions. But they gradually winnowed that down so that they would, at first they reduced the number of questions he could ask. So you can't ask follow-ups. Any journalist knows you need to be able to ask a follow-up. Then they had a security guard standing next to him holding the microphone, and the moment he finished answering, taking it away from him, and so on and so on. So he's someone who has fought back. Other people have fought back at the kind of micro and the macro level, whether it's the Dominion lawsuit over in the United States, which revealed in all its ugly underbelly the workings of news and particularly the Fox News channel, or whether it's the people in the United Kingdom who had been victims of phone hacking, who have fought back through the courts over the years. In some ways, a Pyrrhic victory in the sense that in every case, News Corporation settled those cases on the door of the court, paid large amounts of money to the various phone hacking victims, but spared themselves the time in court where victims of phone hacking would give kind of wrenching personal testimony about what it was like to have your phone hacked. I mean, News Corp wants to move away from that as quickly as possible. They don't want you to dwell on what it means. The most horrible example is of Millie Dowler, the 13-year-old schoolgirl who went missing in the south of England, later found to have been murdered. And in the period between when she disappeared and her parents, obviously in deep and desperate anguish, were trying to find her, as were the police, her phone was hacked by News Corp, by a private investigator working for News Corp. And they wrote stories based on what they saw in her messages and the messages that were being left. They didn't ring the police and say, hey, we're trying to do this. That's what they did. And so they also, when Bob and Sally Dowler, Millie Dowler's parents, at a certain point, a couple of months after she'd gone missing, they went for a walk. They retraced some of the steps of the bus route and so on where Millie Dowler had been, and they were doing that together. They were doing that in private. They'd only notified each other by phone about doing that. And when they got to a tree which had a wanted poster on it, a help wanted poster with a picture of their missing daughter, and Sally Dowler leant out instinctively to touch it, a photographer from News of the World was there, unknown to them, and they ran that photograph without their permission, without their knowledge. So that kind of level of intrusion, lack of care of people, and in absolutely desperate circumstances, that's what they don't want you to dwell on.
Zoe?
Okay?
Yeah, could I just offer that I think that the kind of behaviour that Matthew's outlining, it erodes standards across the board. And it's been very interesting to me being a member of Parliament, so being on the receiving end of journalist calls and inquiries, what we might call demands, and, some of the outright unethical behaviour in terms of the way that journalists behave towards people in politics. I would think that I would never have behaved that way when I was a reporter. So in terms of the power dynamic, for example, routinely we would get sent a list of 10 or 15 questions at 2:30 in the afternoon from usually the News Corporation Murdoch Press, saying we need a response by 3:30. Otherwise we're going to print the piece saying they refused to respond or said no comment. So there's a deliberate effort to send you scrambling, wasting time looking around for answers to unanswerable questions to try to trap you into something. They then, pull in other sources to say things about you that are fundamentally untrue often, but give you no sort of recourse to respond to that. And then they continue to repeat those lies in their publications into infinity, as reported in The Australian, 4 weeks ago, even though it was wrong. So then it becomes sort of part of the truth. And certainly one of the fundamental tactics of Trump is that the more you repeat something, it becomes true. And you're seeing that happen now with One Nation, also a lot of gaslighting. But I think, some of those ethical boundaries get really blurry, and the problem is that once a media organisation or a stable of organisations is getting away with it, then in this sort of clickbait outrage era, others feel that they also have to get in on the act. So it just starts feeding itself.
Oh, Dennis?
Gail, would you mind if I asked Zoe a question?
Of course.
Zoe, that was a most interesting observation. From your observations as a politician, did you think that, or did you observe that the News Corporation reporters in the Bureau in Parliament House had an influence on the rest of the Bureau or not? Or couldn't you tell? The rest of the gallery, yeah.
So not overtly, but I think that it's a culture question. And I mean, we all know that the media business model is broken. We all know that the only way that they're surviving is through clickbait outrage. And so really that's what I'm saying, that because you've seen the Murdoch press not only get away with that but profit from it and build a really successful business model doing that, you now see every other media organisation doing it. And, I mean, I wrote a piece for The Guardian this morning trying to sort of thread the needle on One Nation, to what extent has the media actually created the rise of One Nation? Some of these are unanswerable questions, but to what extent do journalists have a responsibility? Pauline now hates One Nation, so hates the media, so everything she says is misreported according to the media. So there's this really sort of weird relationship that's happening there. But I think that, at the end of the day, the media has to report stuff about One Nation because people are clicking on it, and then that supports their business model. So it's self-perpetuating.
Let's get on to One Nation now, because it's if it gets in 2028, the ABC's, it's the most immediate threat to us, I guess. You likened the moment with One Nation now, like the ping pong ball is rolling down the slope and no one's going to be able to catch up with it. How do you think it's going to go? Like, her polls went up and they've gone down a little bit. Do you think it is absolutely unstoppable now because of clickbait and IT and fake memes and things like that?
Well, I think that what's happening is that One Nation is filling a void. When there's a void, something will fill it. The question is, will it still be filling it in 2 years' time when we get to a federal election? How does something like the Victorian election affect that? If they have a really good showing in the Victorian election, Anthony Green wrote yesterday, and then their performance is absolutely terrible, then they could bomb at the federal election. So there's lots of variables there. But what's been fascinating to me, having covered Trump and obviously, then since observed Trump from afar, is sort of this surprise that people have had about the way that One Nation's behaving, when I just think it's a carbon copy of everything that Trump has done. And so you sort of have similar sentiment in the population where broadly people are pissed off about something. They think they're not being led well. They believe that, the wealth gap means that, elite people are leading them and they're not getting a say and no one really cares about them. Globalisation's negatively affected them. Immigration's negatively affected them. Their children will have a worse life than they've had. We've seen both major parties on the skids. The rise of the independents is part of this. And then One Nation pops up and says, well, if you want to explode the system, we've been here for a while, but we can grow to fill that gap. So the question for me is, what else can grow into that void? So, can independents further grow into that void? Can the Liberals actually somehow fix what's going on there to sort of reinvent themselves? Probably not in time for the 2028 election. So I think there's lots of variables there. But I think that the main thing I learnt from 27 years of journalism and half of that as a foreign correspondent in some really crazy places was that the crazier things get, the crazier they get. And particularly when it comes to politics that I've covered in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa and in the States, that when you're sort of watching something play out thinking, wow, surely this can't be happening, and then it happens. And then an even more weird thing happens. And so, the likes of Cos Samaras would say that Pauline or One Nation has topped out at about 30% of the vote, which is actually identical to where Trump's cement base sits. And, he thinks it can't sort of grow much beyond that, but I think that's dependent on other factors. And I also wonder about people's willingness for experimentation to say, kind of like they did in the case of Trump, well, we'll give disruption a go, we'll try and explode the system once. The thing is, once you've done that, it's really difficult to repair the damage, as we've seen in the States.
Matthew, can I ask you, with the prevalence of what's on social media and entertainment and so on, do you think that there's any way to stop One Nation?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, I get what Zoe's saying about the world gets crazier and crazier, because it does seem to be that. But, there's a couple of things. There's our electoral system compared to the American electoral system, which, people like Anthony Green and Cos Samaras have talked about. There's also, I would both hope and encourage journalists to do their job, which is to actually scrutinise what Pauline Hanson and One Nation are doing. I mean, first here in Victoria, because we've got an election in a few months' time in this state, and secondly, for the federal electoral environment, what are their policies? I mean, I just think they should be turning up at every single media conference and asking, well, what's your policy on this, on that, on housing, on defence, on, climate change, on whatever, and just keep asking that question, because they're not answering it. And I think I heard on the news yesterday that they're planning not to release policies until very close to the election. They think that'll work fine. Well, okay, it will work. It might work fine. It won't work fine if journalists do their job and start scrutinising that and digging into, what Pauline Hanson's policies have been in the past, what other One Nation people's policies, like Malcolm Roberts, what his policies, such as they are. Also, look at. I can't understand why somebody doesn't explain to me, because I don't know, and that's always a good point to start, it seems to me. If you're asking this question, why isn't a journalist asking it? Which is, what are the rules around parliamentarians being in Parliament? I mean, she seems to be in Parliament on an absolutely glancing basis, and yet, I don't know. Is that allowed? Is it not? Does she need to get a pair? I just don't know. But I can't find people writing about that. But that kind of level of scrutiny, I think, is the first necessary step.
Isn't the conundrum there that she's not talking to any of the media who will ask those kinds of questions?
That doesn't mean they can't go and independently do the research and write the piece or broadcast the piece.
Yes, okay, thanks. Zoe.
I was just going to answer the question, which is that no, you don't have to be there, but. You
don't actually have to turn up to do your job.
I've never seen a rule to say you have to attend Parliament, but I know Bob Katter, for example, got caught out where he was in Canberra but he didn't actually enter the chamber during the week that he was there. He was like sitting in his office, and then he got docked his travel allowance because they hadn't marked him off as attending.
But this is really interesting in this. I mean, it's horrible. It's interesting in that one of the things that Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan write about in their book Regime Change about the Trump administration, which has just come out and which I completely recommend you seek out, is that one of the things that Trump has done, and clearly Pauline Hanson and One Nation are copying it, is that if something is not written down in black letter law, like you should not murder someone, pretty clear, but everything else, which is a convention, he just rides roughshod over it. And so, I didn't realise that about the Australian Parliament. All of those, there are so many conventions, most people abide by them. People like Donald Trump and now Pauline Hanson don't.
And so I was the top attending parliamentarian during my time.
Were you also school prefect?
In the Parliament. And the Speaker did call Crossbench Prefect's Corner. So.
Good. Keep going when you can. Sorry.
Can I just add something about One Nation's
You were school prefect too?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I was, and I was then defrocked. On the question of One Nation's support, I worked with Irving Sawlett for about 20 years on the age poll. So I've done quite a bit of public opinion polling. And when One Nation's vote began to rocket up, I began to think this is not an organic shift. This is not what happens. Public opinion shifts, but doesn't shift like a rocket into the sky. And so I began to wonder whether there were other forces at work. And we've just seen reports coming out quite recently in The Age, on the ABC, in The Guardian, about One Nation recruiting so-called helpers or counsellors in the Philippines to support their candidates. And now we're getting more information about potential input from Indonesia. Now, we need to know an awful lot more about this. And if I were still editor of the ABC, of the Age's investigative unit, that's where I'd be sending a couple of reporters into Indonesia to find out what's going on. Because I think this, yes, as everyone says, and certainly as Zoe has said, there's a deep-seated sense of grievance, but that's not the whole story. I'm convinced that there's an artificiality to some of this, and if we need to explore what that is.
Can I just add to that, because that's exactly right. ABC Verify, in fact, ABC News Verify, just recently identified 20 foreign-run Facebook pages operating from countries like Vietnam, Sri Lanka and the Philippines, and these posts use a mix of AI-generated and genuine images combined with compelling but completely fake stories. They've attracted hundreds of thousands of likes, comments and shares, many from very real Australian voters who appear to believe the fake news that they are being served. So this artificially inflates the apparent popularity of the party and distorts online discourse and does deserve much greater coverage, yeah.
And so one of the things that's happening there, I agree, it's really interesting and important work to do, is that, as Zoe's already mentioned, the overall Australian media landscape has changed. Lots of journalists no longer have a job who were in journalism because of the threat to the business model or the pre-existing business model. That's even more, or that's been aggravated in the regions where the big regional media companies, like Southern Cross for that matter, have always been poorer than your Fairfaxes or News or whatever. Now they're even poorer. There are fewer. COVID provided the opportunity for various regional media companies to reduce their presence, and so you get either what are called pink slime newspapers, or ghost newspapers, where there's really no local original content, or there's a radio station or a radio outlet in Brisbane broadcasting about what's happening several hundred kilometres away, but with no local knowledge, no local reporting. So into that news desert, which is the term that's used, you can water it, poison it, you could actually argue, with that kind of stuff. It's going to land with much more force than it would have 20 years ago.
Well, it does, I expect, also open the question of Sky News, which has got its free access to all those people, and how interested the Murdoch empire is in using those organs as well to influence the Australian populace. What do you all think?
Well, Jonathan Holmes had a piece in the Saturday paper yesterday about this, and long story short, they are seeking to do that. They have, it's worth remembering that the ability of Sky News to operate in the regions came about as a result of a change. I can't remember whether it was a regulation or law that Malcolm Turnbull, when he was Communications Minister, introduced. So that was one of the ways they were not previously able to get out into the regions as a subscription or pay TV network. The change in the rules enabled them to do that, and they've built ever since. Same time, rest of local newspaper, the kind of country newspaper that had been there for 130 years, gradually going either downhill or extinct. They're there. Put that together with the kind of operation that Denis is suggesting may be happening, you get a pretty toxic stew going on.
Can I just add too that what does the panel think about Murdoch moving from his support of the coalition, and bearing in mind that Tony Abbott's a director of Fox News, isn't it?
It's a Fox Corporation and paid about $300,000 a year, I think.
Oh, for great. That. Good. Glad to see he's in good employ. Anyway, and Murdoch himself seems to be contemptuous of One Nation, but do you think he'll jump?
Very hard to say at the moment because, as usual, he's talking out of both sides of his mouth because he wants to be sure he backs the winner. And what's going on at the moment is you've got, in a sense, the struggle between the Liberal Party and One Nation. And what I've observed in the Murdoch newspapers is that the Australian has been quite circumspect when it comes to News Corporation, and Paul Kelly, their editor-at-large, has been quite strong against News Corporation.
One Nation.
I want to say about One Nation, but it's tabloid.
I can't think of how often Paul Kelly has written negative things about News Corporation. I think it's a very short list.
It would be a very short list. But I've observed that his tabloids, particularly the Herald Sun and Daily Telegraph, they have taken a very strong pro-One Nation position. So what I'm seeing here is Rupert biding his time, or Lachlan biding their time, to see who looks likely to come out on top. What do you think, Zoe?
Well, I think a lot of these things are about money, of course. So firstly, the apparent pattern of the algorithm is being boosted by lots of money that is buying people's votes, in effect. Secondly, the tabloids need the clickbait, And we know, I mean, I'm clicking on One Nation because it's like, what the hell is going on? So even people who don't support them are clicking on that. But I also think that from a political point of view, and I'm literally just sort of making this up on the fly, having listened to the two of you talk, it's very likely that the coalition or the existing coalition will have to form a coalition with One Nation to hold government. So if the Murdoch press has been, calling out One Nation as a disaster for the country for the preceding 2 or 3 years, and then all of a sudden the day after the election, oh, well, actually they're forming a coalition and we think they're fine now, that's not going to be easy. So it's a little bit sort of strategic potentially to keep it low and wait and see how it evolves.
We're going to change horses in a second, so...
I just think there's a useful comparison with what the relationship between Murdoch and Donald Trump over the years, which, there's no doubt that Rupert Murdoch has played a key role in the rise of Donald Trump. Not the only person and only thing, but definitely a key role. He also, he's also had significant and expressed significant misgivings about Donald Trump. I mean, I think he's described him as an effing idiot at various times. So, and after the election in 2020 was lost by Trump to Joe Biden, Murdoch and News and the New York Post, which traditionally has been a supporter of Trump, campaigned actively against Trump to just get out of politics. So this is a classic New York Post, but when Trump announced that he was going to stand for to nominate for the Republican role in the presidency, they ran a story, and on the bottom of page one, down the bottom, the strapline read, "Florida man makes announcement. See page 34." And so that kind of, the ideological, the commercial, etc., the twinning of those two things and those two forces have been at work for many decades with Trump and Murdoch, as they are here, I reckon, with Hanson and Murdoch.
Yes. We'll get to what the ABC can do about that later. I just want to talk about another specific threat that's not as completely deadly, but the ABC alumni, I'm on the board there we're the ones whose banner was broken. But we put in we work separately from Friends, but also with Friends. But we're an organisation, just an organisation of people who've worked at the ABC, from journalists through techies, through actors, through stage designers, and we're lobbying for the ABC. Very similar aims to ABC Friends, and we've worked very closely with ABC Friends. Anyway, but we put in, Jonathan Holmes actually wrote it, he's on the board too, and we put in a submission to the Royal Commission on Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion, taking very seriously the threat that we felt that the Special Envoy, I mentioned this earlier, for anti-Semitism, Gillian Siegel, her report released last year, called for a standing committee to oversee the editorial practices of the ABC, and we foresaw that she might be doing the same thing when she appeared before the Royal Commission, and she did indeed, and wasn't challenged. In fact, no one has, as far as I know, been challenged at the Royal Commission. They're just taking evidence. We don't know what her actual details of this standing committee that's going to oversee and correct the alleged bias of the ABC is going to be, because no one has seen her submission. But how seriously do you guys take this as a threat to the editorial independence of a public broadcaster?
I'm shuddering, honestly. I mean, it's quite obvious, isn't it? You can't have a standover committee influencing editorial decision-making. It's just totally inappropriate. There are already complaints mechanisms, and we know that the vast majority of the complaints are struck out. So I just think it's incredibly dangerous. I think, the whole tenor of that testimony at the Royal Commission around, well, the ABC should do positive stories about the Israeli government, was just like, what? The ABC is not a PR company. It tells legitimate stories, and unfortunately, I think Jonathan Holmes said in his commentary that what's happening in Gaza is contributing to anti-Semitism. I think that's a reasonable link to make, but it doesn't mean that you can not report what's happening in Gaza. I mean, if it's happening, it's happening. The truth is the truth. Look, I just think, having been on the receiving end of some sort of pretty difficult behaviour in regard to this particular issue, I'm hyper aware of just how emotive it is. But even during my time as a foreign correspondent, as far as I know, the vast majority of complaints that came into the ABC's international department were in regard to coverage of Israel. So there's already a sort of outsized sensitivity around that issue.
Dennis?
But it's worse, because this oversight committee would have the power to monitor the ABC's coverage, and that would be linked to its funding. Because in the report that was produced in July of last year, it was proposed that the public broadcasters' funding should be terminated, was the word used, if the media monitoring of it was found to be deficient in this respect. It beggars belief that a proposition like this was not knocked on the head on day one by the Prime Minister.
And he didn't, and that's part of the problem.
And that's the problem.
He just said nothing.
Normalises it in some way. Yeah.
And he invited her on as an advisor to the Royal Commission.
Yeah, and this proposal would be equally unacceptable if it was being put by a pro-Muslim person. That is, if you were concerned about deeply Islamophobic coverage, the same problem would exist. So it's not particular to anti-Semitism. I'll make another point, which is that the News Corporation as an organisation and Rupert Murdoch have been, they say, fierce advocates for freedom of the press. And I know from personal experience, as does Denis, who also worked on the Finkelstein inquiry, that when recommendations to improve regulation and accountability of the media were proposed by Ray Finkelstein back in 2012, they were vehemently opposed by most of the media, led by News Corporation, on the grounds that this would be a terrible intrusion of freedom of the press and freedom of journalists to do their job. I could be wrong, but I don't think I have seen a word of that sentiment expressed about this particular recommendation from Gillian Segal in News Corp outlets.
No. And ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce to you Stalin, Kim Jong-un and Hitler and Idi Amin, all rolled into one person.
Don't forget Mao Zedong.
Oh, begging your pardon, I'm sure.
Finkelstein review was very good, by the way. Highly recommended reading.
Why didn't it get up? Sorry, what we've just been talking about.
How long have you got?
An hour.
As Cardinal Basil Hume said when asked about the doctrine of papal infallibility, you open a large and difficult question.
Too late.
It's only answerable by the relevant members of the Julia Gillard cabinet.
More not seriously, to expand upon your point, freedom of the press is a really both easy line to put out there and a very appealing one. Who doesn't want freedom of the press? I support freedom of the press. I also support the need for the press to be held properly to account for what it does. It's a powerful institution, and just as it claims the role to be able to be a watchdog on other institutions in society, the parliament, the financial sector, trade unions, the churches, etc., so it should be subject to legitimate scrutiny. That's the bit of the puzzle that consistently either is, again, not talked about, downgraded, and so on.
Well, we can talk about it here because we're at that stage where now we can start to talk about some of the things that could be done, like what is the regulator doing? What's the press club doing? What's the ABC itself doing? Like all the things that, how can we turn this around? Because the ABC and SBS are just about the only reliable sources of news and culture to us, and they're under such great threat. How do we turn this about? What forces in our community do we need to, or our civilisation do we need to employ?
I've got a history of being unkind to the Australian Communications and Media Authority, but I don't want to be unkind because they were set up to fail. They were set up by Paul Keating as what is called a co-regulator, which is to say they cannot really regulate independently. And there have been some people of goodwill trying to make the ACMA work, but they can't. It gets bogged down in legalisms, in court cases, in politics. I mean, I put it to you, Gail. I'm the head of the ACMA, and I want to put Alan Jones off the air. You know, for example, incitement to violence. And so I tell you, as the head of Macquarie Radio, I'm going to make a ruling putting Alan Jones off the air. What do? You go straight to the Prime Minister, don't you? And I get a phone call from the Prime Minister saying, get a grip. That's the atmosphere, that's the environment that the ACMA operate in. So step one would be to recreate the ACMA as a proper regulator. That would be a starting point. And a second point would be to reintroduce the fit and proper person test for the holding of a broadcasting licence. That's 2 steps.
Which existed in its predecessor, the Australian Broadcasting Tribunal. And just to zig and zag with you there, Dennis, to go to the Australian Press Council, which, as Gail mentioned, I was the journalist union's representative on that for a while. They have a different problem, which is that they are a self-regulatory body. They say that we, as a body of media outlets and organisations with public representatives as well, will regulate ourselves in good faith, and so you won't need government to interfere with us. And, long story short, it doesn't work. It hasn't worked. Part of the reason it hasn't worked is that most of the media companies, not only News Corp, but most of them, they don't like being regulated. Big surprise, who does? But they have the ability to stop that. So, the media has a megaphone. If there's ever a debate about this issue, they have a megaphone through their own outlets that most other industries don't have. They might have money, the coal mining industry and so on, but they don't have a megaphone. So that's one of the reasons why media accountability reform doesn't get up. And in the case of the Press Council, the other one, in case you're not aware of it, is that it's about 2/3 of its funding comes from News Corporation. Okay? So because News Corporation is still a large media company, the ABC isn't part of the Press Council because it's publicly funded. And so I think it's a fairly uncontroversial thing to say, based on my 8 years' experience as a member of the Press Council, that they tread very carefully whenever it comes to do with a decision to do with News Corporation outlets.
I think you've got sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy going on in that ACMA has very little power, Press Council has power that it won't use. Journalists then feel, from my point of view as someone who's been on the receiving end of media coverage, very emboldened, unaccountable, and become extremely defensive. I can tell you, if you question, even on a factual basis, things that they've reported, they will argue the toss and try to twist what they've written into, some representation of the truth, when in my experience it isn't. And the problem with all of that then is that it's actually feeding distrust in the press, because we can't have faith in the accountability of the media because there are no reins on them. And I think it's highly problematic. But like social media, when you try to retrofit regulation on powerful forces, you just can't do it. I mean, you've seen it with gambling as well. And the media has immense power over the 2 major political parties. And certainly I think the government of the day is hyper aware, even on something like gambling, that if they go down the track of banning gambling advertising, which reduces the profits of large media organisations, then they can be punished by those media organisations at the ballot box.
Dennis.
There is, I think, a really good solution to this, and it was produced by Brian Levison, who conducted the inquiry into phone hacking. And put shortly, he said what we need is a legislative-based system of self-regulation on all media. So you have you don't have a government regulator, but you have Parliament passing a basic law that says this one's doing, this is how it's going to be done, broadly speaking. You guys will pay for it, and you will be audited every couple of years to see how effective you are. That was, broadly speaking, Brian Levison's recommendation at the end of the phone hacking inquiry. Of course it went nowhere. The Fleet Street media went off their heads. Successive governments in Downing Street just went to water, and they finished up now with a mishmash of weak and semi-weak bodies over there. But there is the idea of a legislative-based self-regulatory system seems to me to be a pretty good way through this.
Okay, I might have to stop our talk. We've got a wonderful possibility there, and we'll be able to converse more, but I'm very keen for all of you to have a say too, because I can see that time is getting on a little bit. So I'll open up to your questions to the floor, and then we'll come back to the... You've got...
We have a microphone. I'm just testing the level now, which is
Dennis's wonderful son is the...
thank you.
Fabulous...
I'm in the show now. I wasn't going to be.
You are now. Okay, so would you put your hand up if you've got a question to ask, please?
My name's Laurie. If you've heard me on Talkback, I'm Laurie from Burton's Lookout. My main concern is the dumbing down of the ABC in as far as its news delivery. You know, I look around the room, I can't see a teenager, I don't think. I'm 73, and, you know, I think most of us remember when we had a 7:45 news bulletin in the morning for 15 minutes. Then we had AM, which went for half an hour. Now it's a news bulletin for 5 minutes at 8 o'clock, so that cuts back AM to 25 minutes. We had a 15-minute news bulletin at 7 o'clock at night on radio. We had 55 minutes of the world today. Now it's only 25 minutes. And a lot of the local news we don't seem to hear because it's taken over by the sort of national and international news. So I really feel for that lack of proper reporting. And I don't know whether it's a chicken or the egg situation that because we don't have the journalists, or whether the journalists were dismissed because we don't have the length of the news that we used to have. And keep in mind that we can't all be watching television. You know, a lot of us are in cars or working around the house. You know, I used to have radios on in many rooms so I could hear everything as I was walking around. Now it's basically on my phone, so, you know, I'm still accompanied by it. But, you know, this is a big concern, and I hope our two ABC people can perhaps enlighten on the whole subject on that. Thank you.
Zoe, thank you.
Yeah, so I think that there is a bit of a chicken and egg thing happening, and I don't know if it's quite to do with the length of the programming. I think it goes back further than that. That I think the ABC, well, firstly, obviously they've had immense budget cuts, so they have less resources to do more with. Well, they're trying to cover the digital landscape as well as their sort of legacy media outlets. But also, the less resources you can put into making news, the less interesting or good it is, and then the less people listen. So it's sort of something that's compounding, I think, onto itself. And I think that's a real problem. I mean, they would argue that not enough people are listening to those programs. I mean, they have cut those programs and changed the format around the 7:45 news and AM, and I completely agree with you, having worked those programs when they were in their prime. But they argue that they're trying to make themselves fit for purpose in an evolving media market. So they're trying to sort of find an audience where the audience is being lost to all of the digital channels. And as Gail said, they're spending a lot of time making podcasts and things like that, trying to find an audience. But the thing is that the more that you scrape back that programming, then the less of an audience that you will have. So it just collapses on itself.
Although digital news is doing very well, ABC Digital News is doing very well. Can I just ask you two, because you work with students all the time, very young people, and you did until recently, what would be their view on this? Do they actually go to the ABC at all, or do they get it second hand through another streaming or?
Okay, well, as someone who's still teaching young people, I think in the last trimester, one of the things I really noticed, it was a unit about the media, obviously, and I started off at the beginning of the semester trying to get a sense of what everybody's media habits were. You know, where do you get your news and information from? And yes, no one's reading the daily newspaper. They don't necessarily either watch the ABC or listen to the ABC. They do, however, are on their social media feeds all the time, and they do get material from the ABC. They may or may not know it's from the ABC, which is a problem in the sense that if you don't know, you've got nothing to argue for, as all of you here would argue for more funding and so on. Gradually during the semester, you're trying to kind of educate people. That is my job to be, well, where are you getting this stuff from? How do you rely on it? Do you rely on it? Do you ask questions about it and so on? And so by the end of the semester, when you do a kind of bit of a check-in with everyone about that, they had started to identify more, yes, I do listen to the ABC or get ABC content more or stuff from The Age or wherever it might be, because I'm noticing that tends to be more reliable and more useful. But it's this is among a group of people who are enrolled in a media course or a journalism course and, had solid work over 3 months with me and other colleagues, obviously. Lots and lots of people aren't doing that. So that's a much wider problem, and it is a real problem.
Look, I reckon it's really complicated to think, as a news director of the ABC, for example, where to deploy your resources. And I think what I've observed is that the 7 p.m. television bulletin has very much been dumbed down. It's very police roundsy. But I think that may not reflect, in particular, a view of news by the ABC, but a question of the different channels and places people can go for news on the ABC. See, I think in recent years, the ABC's depth of investigative reporting has been increased quite significantly. But it only comes out on programs like Background Briefing or Rear View, or programs on Radio National have relatively tiny audiences. And then you've got the question of how much of our resources do we direct into this sort of a digital-first strategy? And I think digital-first really has become the top priority. And so, without a doubt, I think there are areas of journalism that we used to concentrate on, what in newsrooms we call rounds, transport rounds, health, education, and so on, which have been thinned out. That's a pity, but I don't think it suggests to me that the leadership of the news division of the ABC would be making a conscious attempt to dumb the whole thing down. I don't think that's true.
Another question? Up the back there?
Or here?
Or here? Where?
Here.
There. Sorry, you've got the microphone.
My name's Barb. Radio National's fantastic, and I really like... to me, it seems to have changed its focus over the last couple of years, probably, and is very, very listenable too. My question is... how do you contend or fight back against the obvious illogicalities and inconsistencies, for example, of One Nation, of Pauline saying she doesn't agree with late-term abortions that happen a week before the due date, or that if they are using Facebook prompters from those Asian countries, how does that fit in with monoculturalism? I mean, I just really would like, what can we do in terms of containing or even contesting those sorts of ridiculousnesses?
Panel, Dennis is looking keen to go.
Expectant. That's a really, really important question, because what you've tackled, I think, there is the question of how do we report impartially but uncritically? Or I should say critically. And that's a real tension, and it's really difficult. But if you to take the example you've mentioned about the abortion, there is nothing to stop you, or a reporter, checking the state of the law and inserting that into the next sentence of the story, pointing out that this is bullshit. without using the word bullshit. Of course, you've got a time problem. And a lot of resources are actually going in at the ABC, at different universities, at AAP, into almost sort of real-time fact-checking. And we saw quite a bit of that in the 2025 election. I think it's just a question of having the agility to get the bullshit called out for what it is in the time available. That's the trick. And I just think that we're in this situation where we have thinned out newsrooms. We've got all these different platforms we've got to produce content for. And I think there are a lot of tensions playing into that on top of the ethical tension between impartiality and critical reporting.
I think we might have to move on to the next question because we're running out of time and I want to hear from more of you. Next question was at the back there.
Thank you for presenting today. Some really great points made. My question, I guess, is it goes from the top down, truth and accountability. How do we get truth and accountability back? It's media, it's social media, it's a government. We've got mistruths or misinformation being propagated. How do we rein it back in? Because this is the whole right uprising seems to be based on misinformation, and it's gathering obviously steam, and it's people are getting behind causes based on misinformation. So how do we diffuse that, I guess, is my question. It's really quite difficult.
Zoe?
It really is difficult. And it's also a culture war question. I mean, during the Parliament that I was part of, the government tried to implement a misinformation bill that was just turned into a massive argument and went nowhere. But I think that truth in political advertising would be a start federally. I tabled a piece of legislation for a duty of care on social media companies, which had various parameters, but one would have been that the companies need to prove that they have systems in place to show that they are doing something about sort of nefarious use of their algorithms, for example, by, actors with ill means or so foreign influence and other. And I think that the fact-checking piece is also part of it, but it's a case of, I think, those of us who care about these kinds of things need to stop sitting back and going, oh my God, the hard right's got total control of the narrative and there's all this misinformation and lying. We're actually not actually putting something out into the environment ourselves. So certainly since I've left the Parliament, I've been thinking a lot about what kind of presence is required in the information landscape to actually propagate truthful, reasoned conversations and to test some of these questions that you're talking about, because it's sort of the same as what I said before about One Nation. When there's vacuum, someone will fill it. And, we've allowed fossil fuel companies to fill it. We've allowed all sorts of actors and organisations who have a vested interest in running the conversation to run it without actually pushing back on it hard enough.
So, sorry, Don, I'm going to ask you too, but who would fill it then? You think something like community support or, who would fill the vacuum? You're saying that would actually put the other information out there.
Well, I think
there's just good journalism.
There's ways of doing it. Like there's ways of, expanding the podcast market, for example, and not just letting Joe Rogan and Karl Stefanovic dominate that space. I think, and certainly I've had lots of conversations with government about community-based media, the news deserts issue, suburban media. It's a huge problem. It goes to the question before about what the ABC has in terms of news coverage now. Well, there's almost no state-based coverage anymore. There's certainly very little local government coverage unless a council's found to be corrupt or something. But, day-to-day stuff just doesn't get any oxygen. So there's rebuilding there. And I think that actually goes to bigger issues than media. That actually goes to some of the deeper problems in our society around people feeling isolated, communities being fragmented and trust being lost. So, it's a big job, But I think it's building that from the ground up that's where we need to start.
So since it was an overview question, I'll make this a summary because of our time, if you two could add your summary comments.
Well, it's incumbent, I think, on all of us to speak up, to speak out, to attend meetings like this, to make our views known to parliamentarians, I'll make a plug for another book that I think everyone should read, and that's a book called Careless People by Sarah Wynne-Williams, who used to work at Facebook, and it is absolutely jaw-dropping in terms of what she shows you about how Facebook operates and how the most senior people in Facebook operate without any care or concern about what they're doing, going to the point you're making, Zoe. So, we've all got to do that. And the other thing I have quoted on a number of occasions what David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, says, which is, first part of it is that people like Donald Trump want you to be apathetic. Okay, that's what they're trying to induce in you, a sense of apathy, which means you're disengaged, which means you don't do anything. He says apathy and pessimism, you must not give in to them. You just got to pick yourself up and keep talking, keep writing, keep doing whatever it is you do to get your views out there and to take action politically, because there's not much other choice. If otherwise, you are giving in to that kind of what is clearly an authoritarian impulse on the part of the American president.
Okay, Denis.
Just a couple of quick things. Firstly, people like us all have the privilege of the platform. We can't do very much individually, but we must do what we can do. That means putting in an effort and effort in terms of making sure the stuff's well researched, properly presented. But the other thing is, I think the overarching question is one of trust. I think it is very much incumbent upon all leaders in media and all journalists personally to recognise that there is a crisis of trust in all institutions in democracies, and that we as journalists have got a fundamental obligation to do whatever we can to make sure that we do our bit to rebuilding trust, at least in the institution of the media. And fortunately, over the many decades, and I'm looking at poll data going back to the 1950s, the trust in the ABC has always been higher by an order of magnitude than the trust in the commercial media. We need to make sure we keep the ABC for that reason alone, but each of us who has the privilege of the platform needs to make our personal contribution.
Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking these three wonderful people. Denis Muller, Matthew Ricketson and Zoe Daniel.